And thank you for making the switch if you've just flicked channels to join us here on the BBC News channel. It is 21 minutes to 9. Now, trauma surgeons are the people you hope you will never need, but are always on hand to save lives in the most dramatic circumstances.
Our next guest, Morgan McMonagle, was a surgeon on call for some of the biggest events of recent years, including the Westminster bridge attack and the Grenfell fire.
He's written a book to help train other surgeons and is with us now on the sofa. Good morning.
Good morning.
To you.
Thank you for having me in.
Thanks for coming in. First of all, let's start where we should in a conversation like this. What exactly is trauma? What counts as trauma for a surgeon?
Trauma, by definition, is any physical injury or burns. Typically, in the Western world, it affects younger people from the ages of maybe 1 year old right up to 45. It's the commonest cause of death and disability in the younger age group, which, as you know, is also the age group that also are taxpayers or workers who look after family, etc. So it's a huge public health problem as well. So any physical injury.
Can you talk us through what happens when a major trauma incident like Grenfell or the London attacks, Westminster attack, London Bridge attack happens for you in your job?
Well, I'm very proud to say that since the initiation of the UK-wide trauma system and the London trauma system, each hospital now has a major incident plan, and that will always kick into play when word comes in. So, for example, on the afternoon of the Westminster Bridge attack, in fact, often what happens, the BBC, for example, put out that this was happening at the time, and very quickly the emergency services on scene will contact the hospital, and there's a command system that trickles down almost like a hierarchy that will kick things into play. On the coalface, you would often have a trauma team, and I happen to be the surgeon in the hospital that day looking after trauma, but also the emergency department and the nurses there will kick in to receive the patients as they come in, depending on the amount coming in.
Let's take a quick look at you in action, because you were filmed for a BBC documentary at hospital. Let's see how your team was reacting to the Westminster Bridge attack.
Can I ask you, at least for the next 20 minutes, to put some of the emotion and some of the other thoughts in our heads around the incident to the back of your mind, and let's focus on the clinical problems for patients.
Okay, the two French chaps on a tour from Brittany. He had a large laceration on his scalp, which was sutured by the plastic surgery service last night. Of all the patients from yesterday, he's probably the first one who can probably be discharged.
Okay.
Next paddle back to France.
Gives you an extraordinary insight there into that moment. Talk to us about the ethical challenges you must face, particularly in the aftermath of a terror attack, where you might find yourself treating a terrorist.
Yeah, I think most people, when you get to that senior level, you have to put your emotions aside, and you also have to put your judgment aside. It's not my role to judge at that time. Secondly, you could be wrong. I mean, you don't know. Nobody comes in and says this is the person who has caused this mayhem, although it's usually quite obvious because that particular person was shot on that day. You treat every person exactly the same as you would, and it's up to the police and our judiciary and society to decide what happens after that. And personally, I would rather someone survived and, you know, stood for their crimes rather than didn't. So it's really only in hindsight you can consider that, but at that time you treat everybody exactly the same.
I mean, you're human, and when something like Grenfell, London Bridge attack happened, and you're dealing with those people coming in who are seriously injured, how do you cope with that on a personal level? How do your teams cope with it?
I think it comes down to resilience, and everybody's resilient in a different way. I think if you're attracted to what we call an acute specialty, like surgery, trauma surgery, anaesthetics, emergency medicine, I think your resilience in general is a little bit different, and that's why you're attracted into it. And really, as part of your training and your experience over many, many years, resilience is really how you bounce back or how you cope after a tragedy like that in life. And I think the most important thing is your experience, your attitude, maintaining a very positive attitude, and probably the most important thing is peer support. Like not just societal support or family support, but your actual peers who have a common shared experience. Like soldiers in war, they have a common shared experience. And even when you look back on papers that have looked at the psychology of resilience, it's the peer support is the most important thing to them.
I suppose you can't really prepare for that in advance because you deal with it, and these things don't happen very often in someone's career.
Correct, but every trauma that comes in is its own mini tragedy for that family and for the patient and for the team looking after them.
What is it that drew you into this line within the medical field? Because there must be all sorts of areas within your broader profession which would be, well, frankly, I suspect perhaps a little easier than being a trauma surgeon.
Yeah, you don't choose it for easiness, you choose it for job satisfaction. There are definitely some people out there who prefer a 9-to-5 job. There are some people who don't. And I travel the world. I travelled in trauma surgery in the United States. I used to work in helicopter retrieval work in Australia. So it kind of attracts that sort of almost like an adrenaline junkie that would be drawn into that kind of work.
Talk to us about the coordination that goes on between hospitals, because I guess that's absolutely crucial. And I wonder the extent to which that has improved, so that in the event of a terrorist attack or something like the Grenfell Tower, that the collective resources of a city and sense of expertise from people like you and your colleagues is harboured in the best and most efficient way.
Yeah, so like, for example, in London, there are 4 major trauma centres, and they would work closely with planning when it comes to major disasters, whether it's a deliberate tragedy like the Westminster Bridge, or something that's not deliberate like Grenfell, or even a major pile-up on a motorway, for example. We work closely with the pre-hospital care, London Ambulance Service, or any ambulance service throughout the country would also kick in. There is a London office that tends to coordinate that on a sort of more academic level as well. We're also, I mean, every time something like that happens, you have to learn something from it, because no plan is ever perfect, ever. And now we're doing a lot more close work with the police, for example, about what their role is in a tragedy, what our role is, and how we can come together, even a little more cross-pollination and thinking when it comes to, unfortunately, when the next one happens, as opposed to if. You've
written a whole book about this, helping to support new trauma surgeons, but what would you say the biggest learn has been for you, and the thing that you want to share with people going forward? I know it's hard to distill it down to one thing.
It's really hard. You mean from the tragedy itself? Yes. I think, I'll come back to knowing your peers, and it's a real pleasure to be able to train and get trained and share experiences with my peers who have similar experiences in different parts of the world and country. And I think moving forward, it's what I get from our peers. And the best thing about the NHS is the absolute esprit de corps, that people rise up every single time. The people behind the NHS are absolutely world class with the service they deliver on a day-to-day basis, and we should be very proud of that.
Just going back to an element of the conversation we were having a few moments ago, and you were reflecting on the comparison between those of you in your profession and soldiers on the battlefield in terms of that peer-to-peer support afterwards. To what extent has that really developed in the last few years? Because we've become much more aware, haven't we, as a society, of things like post-traumatic stress disorder.
Correct. And I mean, I'm not military, but certainly in St Mary's Hospital, soldiers do, our military people do rotate through. We have some on staff. And similarly at Queen Elizabeth Birmingham, where I also trained, when I was training to be a surgeon, has a military section as well. And so compared to the United States, and I know a lot of the military guys in the United States, they tend to train separately. But we're quite unique in the NHS. I mean, it really is such a flagship training programme that the military guys and the civilian guys train in parallel, and they both learn from each other. It's a very nice symbiotic relationship between the two.
It's been fascinating talking to you. Thank you very much for coming in. We really appreciate it. And the new series of Hospital will come to BBC Two next year.